Our brains are wired for progress. We're always chasing more sets, more reps, adding more weight to the bar, and sometimes just chasing too much complexity. Sometimes we actually need to scale it back and make things more simple so that you can actually make progress. Now, in today's episode, I want to break down where you can simplify things, why you should simplify things, so that you can continue to show up and make progress. It's not always about adding more or doing more. Sometimes it's just about doing things better. Now, I'm all here for it. I love people that show up with intent, that work hard, that put a lot of effort into everything that they do. And, from a motivation standpoint, from a progression standpoint, it feels epic to be adding weight to the bar, but to doing more work, to be chasing progress. I get it. I fully understand. But sometimes chasing the grass is always greener on the other side. It's not always greener. Sometimes you just need to spend time working the basics in order to make the basics better. Because there is that saying that simple works, right? It does. It works every single time. Now, you want to be, especially with training, you want to be specific for the adaptation that you're chasing. You want to be specific to what you're trying to get out of your training. But the reality is sometimes it gets too complicated. You need to be, doing all these different training methods. You need to be doing different undulating schemes. You need to be doing these intense warm-ups that, really stretch you out and take you into these crazy ranges of movement. But the reality is, a lot of it is just so nuanced and is really unnecessary, to be completely honest with you. Now, what I want to talk about is when you start your training journey, think of it like this. You're building a base. It's a foundation for a house where in that base, you're stacking up all these awesome qualities that you want. Range of movement, control, muscle mass, strength, coordination, everything involved in that. Then you have another layer. This could be the concrete side of things where you've got your nutrition, you've got your recovery, and you've got all these components that make up the base of your training process. Now, once you've done that and you've built a significant base, often we then start to chase more progress. We're like, how do we continue to keep winning? How do we do more to get more out? But often we forget that the successes that we have along the way are actually a result of the simple things, not the complex things. So when you look at training programs, we need to apply that same sort of filter and that same sort of logic to it. Now, often, when we're looking at a training program for someone that's really advanced, it's all big compound movements. It's really specific and there's no low-level stability, control, coordination stuff in there. Now, sure, the argument is that it's not going to have a direct adaptation or carryover to, say, a main heavy squat, deadlift, bench press. But the reality is if you are moving better and you can control segmental movements better, you have better muscle activation and you can move one with disassociation, but two then together, you're going to be a more well-rounded athlete. Now, this is what it leads us into. So when we're looking at someone that's starting in the gym, it's very much a ground up approach, where you're building everything, then you get to a certain point, and then you might change a lens a little bit, and then you may set a target in a distance and work back from that target. Now, I think for advanced lifters and people that have been in the gym for a considerable amount of time, we need to loop back to that at periodic phases through your training. You cannot just continue to get stronger without acknowledging the fact that you still need to move like a human. So there are certain qualities that will actually keep you injury-free. Now, if you know anyone that's been pushing really, really hard, you will know that one of the hardest things in keeping them moving forward is keeping them in the game. Remaining injury-free is crucial. It is very, 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 very important. And part of that, and one of the most easiest ways to approach that, is to make sure that you actually have a baseline movement and you don't lose sight of what actually got you to being strong. Now, an example to this, if you're 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks out from comp, sure, you may not be doing coordination drills and little isolated exercises to build up specific small components. of your training. Granted, I understand that's unnecessary fatigue, it's unnecessary stress, and at that point in time during a training program is probably just not, you couldn't justify it being in there. But directly after comp, or, periodic phases through the year, say you weren't doing comp prep and you were just sort of training, you could have periodic phases during the year where you actually dial it back a little bit and you work on stability, control, coordination. This is what I want to lead into. So the areas that I would say are really, really important for you to work on and keep a baseline level of it. Now, if you think about the big compounds, let's just talk about powerlifting. If you've got squat, bench, and deadlift, they are very specific movements, but you're working 1% of your actual available movement, and you're training that over and over and over again. Now, if you only train that over and over and over again, you're going to become quite fragile and quite weak outside of those movements. So you want to have baseline exercises in there that are going to expose you to different ranges, expose you to different positions so that you're not fragile. I was having a conversation with a guy the other day and specifically around the lower back. And, a lot of people will say that you cannot flex your lumbar spine. Now, I would also go to say that changing the position and flexing your spine whilst moving is not great. It happens from time to time, but it's not great. But learning how to lift not in the ideal or not in the perfect position can actually be quite helpful. Like say, for instance, you are a deadlifter that, takes on a bit more of a rounded position through the upper body. If you're doing RDLs or you're doing good mornings or you're doing something to support that deadlift, it's probably a good idea to do it in the not perfect position. So a slightly more rounded position, because you're going to build up some resilience. You're going to build up some muscle mass in those positions as well. So it's not actually always about doing things perfectly. But in saying that, you would want to have other exercises that would train what is defined as perfect, and a perfect hinge with great control through your lumbar spine, all the way from your neck, all the way down to your pelvis. So there's context to this as well. But if I was looking at it from, an upper body perspective, and this is the way that I look at it as well, is, with a very specific movement that you're doing, you're training a repetitive pattern over and over and over again. So you're going to get stuck in this small window, which means that not necessarily overuse, but you're going to have tension spots in the system. Tension spots, which are going to then limit other areas. So say, for instance, I was doing a ton of bench press, I'm retracted, my shoulder blades depressed, they're locked down. Any time that I have to reach or press my arm up overhead, I run into the risk of the fact that my shoulder blades don't move, because all I've done is extended, retracted, and pulled them down. So I haven't actually been exposed to that overhead position. So having exercises that, incorporate some reaching, like a landmine press or, a bottoms up press, or even something that's more progressed than that, just like a push-up hold with a reach and a retraction, like just a scapular shoulder press, can actually be really beneficial to getting your shoulders moving. So you've got to almost reverse engineer the positions that you do over and over and over again, and then try and expose yourself to it. Now, in an eloquent way of training, you would just plan out certain phases of the year where you work on, let's say January through to March, you might work on stability, coordination, control, and you can work on all of that stuff whilst progressing your main lifts. That's not a problem at all. But then your accessory exercises are driving a specific adaptation that you want. When you move into, say, a hypertrophy-based phase, you might then go, okay, well, in that phase, I'm going to work longer lever stuff. I'm really going to force range of movement, control, tempo, and work more so on metabolic and mechanical stress. That's a very different quality to stability and isolation. And then when you move into strength-based training, you might then go, okay, well, what are the exercises that are going to have the best bang for my buck? What is going to carry over to my main lifts and help me be stronger in those main lifts? Because everything's gearing up to be stronger, right? So you want to then support that system. So through those different phases, you're going to drop off certain exercises because you can't train every quality at once. So you'd want to look at your year and go, okay, for this part of the year, I'm going to train certain components. Towards the back end, I'm going to drop those components. And that's totally fine, providing you pick them back up at a later point. And, I often see people get sort of to that point where they get towards the end of the year, but they don't reintroduce in patterns. And this becomes an issue. And, if we look at youth development, there's a lot of people that are younger and younger getting into strength training now, which is really, really awesome. But they're over specializing way too soon. So they're not spending time, building up a base quality of strength, hypertrophy, movement, control, everything in between. And they're overly specializing in on, say powerlifting, for instance. And that's all well and dandy for powerlifting, but it makes them incredibly fragile. They may be good for the first 5 years of that training journey, but once they get to a certain point where there's, a resistance point, there might be an injury or they've just in pain constantly. It's often because they're so imbalanced. They've done so much specific work and they haven't accounted for baseline movements. And you get a massive group of people which really kind of demonize any movement that's outside of the specific adaptation that you're trying to get. And it's such a short-sighted goal. Like, you can push someone really, really hard, really, really specifically for a considerable amount of time, but there will be a point where they break. There will be a point where they have an injury or they're just so demotivated because they're constantly just having to step up to these heavy weights over and over and over again. Now, if we regress that back a little bit, so let's look at the upper body, specifically scapular control. A Cuban press is a really big, if you don't know what it is, look it up. It's a really big exercise that takes your shoulders through a huge range of movement into internal, external rotation, up into an overhead position. And it can be done in different positions, laying down, it can be done on a bench, it could be done seated with cables, et cetera, et cetera. In theory, it ticks a lot of boxes, but the level of movement, available movement that you need to do an exercise passively and actively, number one, is crazy. Two, you need so much body control and awareness to actually execute that exercise. And three, have you ticked off the lower level exercises first? So I argue the fact of is that too much too soon? Why not just break it down into individual components? Let's work on getting overhead. Let's work on the internal and the external rotation, because in isolation, if you can build up the strength qualities, stability qualities, coordination in isolation, when you do incorporate them back into a bigger, more compound-based exercise, you're going to have a better chance and more successes of actually getting what you need out of that exercise. Now, another example of this for the upper body and the scaps is like a face pull. You pull back, you get that really nice retraction and depression of the shoulder blades, you get the external rotation at the shoulder. But the reality is a lot of people, as a result of doing specific training over and over and over again, lose the ability to actually externally rotate. So then if I'm forcing you or asking you to do an exercise that has a huge amount of external rotation in it and you can't physically get into that position, are you actually getting what you need out of that exercise? You're just going to compensate and kind of move upstream or downstream as a result, because you'll always get the job done. So, when we're looking at these exercises, we're not just talking about these big compound movements. If we look at rehab, in all honesty, the simpler, the better. Any movement-based strategies, if we think about core training, for instance, and you think about one of the most simplest exercises, a dead bug, you're laying on your back. 99.99% of people execute it as an extension-based exercise. They hold all this tension in the lower back, but they completely miss the abs. So by pushing down and really driving your rib cage down, tucking your pelvis under, you find yourself in this position where you actually start to shake. And that's your nervous system. It's going, wow, I haven't had exposure to this position. I'm not particularly comfortable here. I am safe because it's a lower level exercise, but I'm not comfortable. So you want to actually regress it back so you can get the most out of these positions before you then start to progress through. So I think, if you're either self-programming, you have a coach, or you're subscribing programs for people, you've got to look at is complex better? Simpler always wins. And, if you can put someone in a position where they feel it, they're like, wow, that tissue, my glute or my abs or my shoulder, or my lat, I feel that more than anything, that exercise is going to be far more beneficial than, for instance, like let's say a lat pull down. If you can do a single arm lat pull down with a cable and you're like, wow, I get this epic contraction of my lat. But then I say, hey, can you do some chin ups? And all you feel is your forearms. Which exercise is better for your lats? Just in theory, because it's a big compound exercise that, targets a lot of muscle mass, doesn't mean that a pull-up is going to be a better exercise for someone, because sometimes the regression of an exercise is actually better because you can get better mind-muscle connection, you can push the tissue harder, you can get more volume out of it, and you have less compensation. So, in a well-designed training program, really, you should account for these things throughout the training year. It should just be part of your program that you don't really think about, and it will go through phases. But if you're on the other side of it, where you're actually looking at prescribing these things, start to challenge your thinking around it a little bit and go, hey, is more better? Can I simplify this? And can I periodize and set little chunks throughout the year, little phases where I actually work on different qualities outside of specific qualities of strength and hypertrophy that you're chasing? You'll get so much more out of your training and your results. That's it for me on today's episode. I will see you guys on the next one.